you're still making the decisions of like pulling the trigger, or yes, I am going to confirm to drop the bomb, or yes, there is like bad dudes inside of this house. But the whole drone application now is just so disconnected. You know, I think we've all seen the amount of like drones flying over guys in foxholes and just dropping a grenade on them. There's not really a whole lot of chance where artillery can fall around you, and it's still a human, loading that round. Drones just to me are a little, it's just weird. It's weird warfare. It's very impersonable, and I think it takes away what you're doing to another human with that operator on the other side.
You are 100% correct.
We have a weapon more powerful than the British Empire, and that weapon is our refusal to bow to any order but our own, any institution but our own.
Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Let Them Eat Cake. I am your host Jack, my co-hosts are John and Ace, and what is this week's topic?
Today we're going to have an interview with Project Leaflet. He's been doing a lot of work in Ukraine involving training and things like that, but he also has a history of being in Iraq at one of the most crucial points there, and it's a lot of people don't have an advanced understanding of Iraq, but where he was is the only place where Al-Qaeda actually was in Iraq, which is Mosul. And after everyone's focused on the Battle of Fallujah, but the Battle of Mosul is really when ISIS comes to be, because Zarqawi starts working with Al-Qaeda there. And so he basically got on the ground in Iraq there and witnessed that battle and just saw Mosul change. And it's still not the same. It's always been just an extreme insurgency checkpoint that they always go to. But then we also talk about the evolution of drones and drone warfare in Ukraine and some of the stuff going on there. But also, while he was in Iraq, one of the things that in Mosul, we found the biggest chemical weapons lab that was ever found in the War on Terror. And it's like an insane lab. It looks like they're trying to make Frankenstein in it. And with chemical weapons, we also have an information hazard in Iran right now. There has been hundreds of girls getting sick and being sent to the hospital. It is suspected to be a deliberate poisoning, but there's a lot of misinformation around this because right when it happened, people kind of ran with the ball and said, "Oh, it's a chemical attack, it's a chemical weapon." And then even like the reports said they found nitrogen gas, which is the most common gas in the atmosphere. It's not something indicative. So you never know. It could have been like a food allergy. And, everyone's food got contaminated, but it's been happening over months. And this also happened before in Afghanistan. And it was kind of undiscovered and like nobody figured out what was going on. And we kind of expect the same thing to happen in Iran because it's probably most likely linked to the government. But we don't know. But all we know is that they're suspected deliberate poisonings. And anything other than that is kind of running with the ball and letting Iran win because one of their main tactics is to dilute the information space. They want to discredit them because they'll make people start saying that they were hit with sarin gas. And like, you don't live through that, And so they'll get protesters saying that. They'll build bots that will say that shit. And it just completely pollutes the information space. So while we're on the topic of current events that are probably going to be escalating tensions, we want to talk about the Americans that were just kidnapped in Mexico. And Ace is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so a day or two in Mexico, 4 Americans from South Carolina who were there for a cosmetic procedure, a tummy tuck basically, were kidnapped in their van it was, and they turned up dead quite recently. And I just think it's an interesting thing to talk about because not too long ago, WNBA star Brittany Griner there was a prison exchange for her and a Russian arms dealer known as the Angel of Death after Griner had already spent months in Russian prison for bringing marijuana into the country, right? So, and I think it's just an interesting thing to talk about because anytime an American gets killed in another country or gets sent to prison in another country, especially Mexico, there's always this kind of two sides of the coin where it's like there's one side where you'll have more conservative people, more like Republican-leaning people saying they're being soft and they're not doing enough and they're not trying hard enough to get these Americans back. And then there's the other side that kind of just waits and lets the situation play out and sees what's going to happen. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion to have on what should the U.S. do or the State Department do about American prisoners in other countries, American hostages in other countries, or people who have been killed by criminal groups in foreign countries, Americans who have been killed by criminal groups in foreign countries, especially one that's as close to us as Mexico, where it's like, it seems at least on a surface level that there is a very easy capability to kind of not necessarily like go in like boots on the ground, but to find these people and to know who's responsible and to more covertly take these people out. So it is an interesting conversation to be had.
All right, so yeah, and they were kidnapped by the Gulf Cartel, which it's one of the big three, but they're pretty notorious around the border. But two of them were actually found dead. We think one of them may have died right at the shootout, maybe both of them, and then a third one was in critical condition. And then, so I think they've already exchanged them. They've already dealt with the cartel. It was actually a mistake by the cartel. They thought they were like Haitian drug traffickers. I think I have it right in front of me.
Oh
here.
shit, that's awful.
Yeah, so they literally because they were all African Americans, they thought they were Haitian drug traffickers and like they were trying to like hijack their supply. So it was kind of like a mistaken identity, and the Gulf Cartel kind of fucked up. But it comes at a really important time because we have Ann Coulter on Timcast talking about how we should invade Mexico. We have
yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, Goblin Toes, talking about how she wants to invade Mexico and start bombing the cartels and things like that. So it really came at the worst time because there's a lot of accelerationist towards war in Mexico rhetoric. And I predicted this a long time ago, talking about the border wall, about how the border wall is just going to end up being a point about how there's going to be a war over the border or something like that. So, and speaking of
about how
down
we should
south,
basically clean up the cartel problem.
yeah, and but the thing is that it's not. It's
Like it's
Mexico's
responsibility.
problem. We're the market. We can legalize drugs. We can force them to legitimize. It's just like the mafia was running garbage.
Well, the other thing too.
Waste management is a fucking ex-mafia.
The relationship between the areas that the cartels control and the Mexican government is so unbelievably complex that if we were to somehow disrupt it, it would just fuck everything.
Also, the majority of Mexico's population is only in like around Mexico City. Most of Mexico is not populated because it's a very it's got like a golden range, and it's where Mexico City is, and that's where people have always lived. But also, speaking about problems down south, we also have some accelerations in the Cop City protests. And I know Jack is always interested when people are throwing fireworks and stuff at police. So,
well, yeah. So there I guess we saw a group of, as they're saying, as Antifa. I guess they probably are. I guess you could probably classify them that way. Is that how they're identifying? I'm not actually sure. Like, have they said that they've done it?
no, well, Antifa doesn't exist. Antifa is an idea. So yes, they're all Antifa. As long as it's a left-wing protester, it's Antifa. That's how it works.
Sure. Okay.
It's a broad classification for everyone.
Sure.
But they all circle. Like some.
Well, it's black bloc at the minimum. We'll just say that.
I don't think that's a thing either, though. It's just people who care about some trees.
They're anarchists.
Yeah, there's anarchists there for sure. There's communists.
I feel like there's probably a big spread of ideologies.
Mm-hmm. That's what they said. Like, because there's just regular hippies there too who just want to save the forest.
Someone get Rose Warfare in here right now. He made a documentary about this.
But yeah, they attacked a police compound. The cops ran like pussies, which was very funny. And they were throwing fireworks. And they've been hit with domestic terrorism charges, which doesn't really makes sense because terrorism is technically uh, fear and
It actually
violence against civilians.
you require a felony to be committed, and they've only been charged with misdemeanor charges. So
Is
domestic
that actually a
terrorism
thing?
domestic terrorism technically shouldn't be a charge that's upheld by the Supreme Court, but that's not the point of why they're charging them as an intimidation tactic,
Yeah,
because it
it's a
has
scare
like a
tactic.
mandatory minimum of like 5 years or something.
Yeah, that's all it is. They're just trying to scare people out of protesting.
And the entire town basically doesn't want this place and this police complex to train police, and and the government has voted for it, the corporations have paid for it, and so most of the funding is coming from big budget corporations like Chick-fil-A, Home Depot, UPS, Delta Airlines, Wells Fargo.
Chick-fil-A.
Yep.
Yeah, I
And like
laughed
the
at
only
that
one
as
that
well.
makes sense there is like home or UPS, because you see UPS trucks get hit all the time. So UPS, I can see why they would want to invest in police, but it's just like Home Depot, all this stuff,
Wells Fargo.
Delta
Wells
Airlines.
Fargo kind of makes sense.
So
Yeah.
they basically have a company, a corporate backer for the police. This corporation of companies come together to make an entity, and they have a representative that is basically someone who is a corporate entity in the police department, and that entity then has basically set up this complex that works with the police. So it's direct, like basically just financial, like fronting, and nobody wants it there, but because the corporations are going to pay for it, they're also going to make the taxpayers pay 30% for it as well. So the people that live there also are going to have to pay taxes to pay for 30% of the bill. And they've also been breaking the law because there's permits that they have where because the activists have like said that like you can't go past this line. They've had successful stoppages and permits and things like that, and the police have just been building it anyway. They don't care about the law.
It's because cops are above the law. Didn't you know that?
Mm-hmm. So we'll just get to the interview. But so interview with
Well,
Project
do you want me to
Leaflet.
do a transition?
Sure.
I'll do it. Okay, I'll work it in.
So with
there
that, we'll just get to our interview with Project Leaflet.
No.
Really great interview today.
Transition's not good.
Fine, I just got it.
My name's Chris Naganuma, and I own Project Leaflet. I'd say it's kind of a mix of open source intelligence, talking with guys that are overseas and documenting their stories, and getting combat photography as often as I can by heading downrange. For me, it just kind of came about naturally, I guess, because I had started out when the war really kind of broke out through doing gear acquisition and connecting the dots for people. We kind of have a network through Signal that a lot of us are in country and out of country, and we help move things around. And that I started reporting a lot on like what was going on over there and just placing it on my personal page. And my personal page started getting a lot of attention, and so I wanted to kind of separate it, and that's how the leaflet kind of came about. And then that took off pretty quickly, just by sharing a lot of that footage.
You've also been on the ground and been able to get your own footage at the same time too. So
Yeah, I went over with Nick from Battles and Beers.
they're awesome. They're great.
Yeah, Nick's a great dude, and we had tried to put a plan together, and then we had hooked up with Atlas Global Aid, who supported our trip over there and took care of our flights and helped us with a translator, and put a medical personnel with us, and we were able to kind of move around the country for about 3 weeks. We were over there doing just documentation, really a lot of interviews and photography with a mix of different people, not just frontline fighters, but civilians and people that were also had a small hand in the war that's going on over there.
There's been a lot of issues with NGOs and things like that.
Yeah.
You actually worked with one to get over there. You've actually done gear acquisition. How do you kind of sort out between what's good and bad, and where to put your because people are throwing money out there, and there's scams happening every day that we see.
Yeah, that's definitely been a learning process over the last 10 months. When I first started doing this, probably in month 1 and month 2, there was a lot of NGOs that we were kind of either working with or that I had personally gotten involved with. And you just slowly start to see them break away. And I think because initially when the war started out, a lot of things were really kind of loose, and like anyone could just kind of go over there and fight. People were going over there and doing all kinds of different crazy things, acting as NGOs or nonprofits. And as time went on, either that support for them kind of dwindled or their organization really wasn't there because Ukraine and a lot of the people coming in needed to have actual like paperwork documentation and stating what they're doing as time went on. And so you see a lot of these, I think, smaller organizations really kind of just couldn't keep up or couldn't organize themselves well. And then even now, some of the larger ones are having problems maintaining money. And, I know a lot of guys that have kind of nuked their own life trying to make this continued and make this work.
This is very similar to Afghanistan. There was all kinds of people going in there because there was just bounties on people's heads, and they were just letting anyone go in that country. And there's so many people because like the guy who Bloodsport is based on is just like his story's entirely made up. Like he said that like he's like been in the SEALs and CIA. There's tons of those guys over there where they were just pretending that they were like special ops, and they would be going in and actually like arresting, detaining, and then like tortured people. And they weren't like on the books for anyone. They were just guys over there who were bounty hunters. And it was just complete lawlessness.
Yeah, month one and month two was definitely more lawless. Now anyone that wants to fight in Ukraine, they got to have a green book, and they're doing enlistments. Most people start through the Legion. So, when I was over there, everyone was pretty well documented. Things were pretty strict. I had to get a press pass with the MOD, and that helps me move around the country. They don't just kind of if you don't have that, like going over there with a camera and just becomes a lot harder to move through checkpoints. So I think they're getting a lot stricter on who can enter.
There was a lot of foreign people going over to Ukraine to fight. A lot of them, I remember hearing stories where it was like they would go over there but not allowed to leave. Like they would basically trap them there. How common was that, did you find? Or how common are international fighters over there?
There's a lot of international fighters. There's a fair amount of dudes. When we did our interviews, I think we did about 30 of them, and maybe a small handful, 5 of them, 6 are actual Ukrainians. The other ones were all predominantly Western fighters, Georgian Legion, guys that had some type of affiliation back to Ukraine and just decided, hey, like either, hey, my family was from here, or, hey, I want to go get busy and kill some Russians. A fair amount of dudes that were prior military vets, then went over and fought with the Kurds, and then now they're over in Ukraine. That tended to be a pretty normal rotation for a fair amount of the guys that I've seen. So
Are
that
they just like freedom fighters, or are they like
no,
mercenaries?
they're all in
Just,
this.
it's like they did their military contract, and then they went to the YPG International, and now they're in Ukraine.
Yeah, right. And then when they went to Ukraine, a lot of these guys, they're all under contract. So they're all either with the Legion or they're with the SSO. They're either signed a 1-year or a 3-year contract. They've got what's called a green book, which states that, hey, I'm military, I'm listed. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't ran into any guy that's over there that's like, I'm just here to get paid, I'm just here to get money. The mercenary title is something that's so far off of anything that I've experienced in regards to what a mercenary actually is and what these Westerners are actually
And
doing.
I mean, you have experience with mercenaries, I'm sure.
Look, I haven't experienced any of them.
Well, military contractors,
That,
not just
what's that?
military contractors, not actual you know, like what are they? Not like Wagner mercenaries, but there was military contractors in Iraq.
Sure, there's contractors, but you can't say that Blackwater Global or Dynacore or any of these dudes are mercenaries. They're
I agree. But the one of those was pretty controversial, but
like B-Dub.
Yeah, I mean, but they,
Maybe the term itself is a bit outdated. Maybe we should use a different term.
Well,
What?
mercenary is like
Mercenary
you can
Russia
label guys
depends
that
on
are like
mercenaries for
Mm.
their military. They can't
Well,
field a
well, in
military
that
without mercenaries.
sure. I mean, in that sense, would Russia have more mercenaries on their side then?
Yeah, they need them. Yeah.
Mm. Because I remember that they were pulling prisoners out for
for Wagner.
Wagner,
Some of
which is
some of
pretty
those
fucking
prisoners
wild.
are free now. Some of them survived.
No shit.
Yeah, they had a big post about it, like the first rotation of guys that
Mm.
survived through their tour and got released. It's not a lot. Bakhmut's to like talk about these guys that are going in from prisoners. It's been estimated that 50 of the 1,000 prisoners that were pulled from Bakhmut, 40 plus thousand of them are dead. So it's not like these guys are having great odds. But to their point, I'm sure Wagner probably needs the forces, and
They
they
definitely
probably are
do.
looking at it as an out.
Yeah,
Well,
I
and
mean,
Wagner also
why
has
else would you?
priorities that they have in other places in the world too. They're not just operating in Ukraine, and the
Oh, they're
same goes
definitely
for
sending their
Russia.
best people down to Africa.
It
They're
depends. It
100%.
depends. But also, one of Russia's big problems is that they have too many officers in their military.
Really
Hmm.
Yeah, they don't have a big NCO branch like we do. Um,
interesting.
you know, that's something that kind of hampers them pretty well. What I mean by that is like if you look at like the U.S. Marines or U.S. Army, a lot of those guys that are your E3s, E4s, E5s, your very middle ground branch, we can war off of them. We don't necessarily need a lot of high command. Those guys are very operational on their own. They understand what's going on. They understand shoot, move, and communicate. Um,
They
you know,
probably understand
Russian
better than
doesn't
a
work
lot of
that way.
officers, right?
Say that one more time.
They probably understand a bit better than a lot of officers, I imagine. That's how it is here, where a lot of the NCOs would be more proficient and trusted by the soldiers than their officers.
Yeah, you got to understand that like a lot of the officer guys, there's only like one platoon officer per platoon, like in the infantry.
Yeah,
And a lot of the time the NCOs have a lot more time and experience or time on field than the officers have. And so that's why that there's usually a different type of trust relationship where it's like, yeah, you are an officer, you are in charge of all these guys, but if you're a brand new butter bar, like shut the fuck up and understand like what's going on here and learn from your guys. The
yeah.
downside with the Russian forces is that they're running a lot of things officer based and control based. So unless they get a direct order from someone of higher, there is no middle ground NCOs that are saying, "Hey, we should probably adjust 400 yards off to our left side because we're getting hammered here." Like they'll just continue to get hammered until an officer tells them to do something different. It's not very it's very old style of warfare.
But on the other hand, I think this is probably where you'd have mercenaries kind of make up for that because they can kind of operate and be doing their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know Wagner. I don't know how they operate.
Yeah, me either.
Um,
I know some stuff about them, but
yeah,
it's
every force has a place. And Wagner seems to, at one point in time, have been a very decent operational team. I think now they've cycled through a very large amount of their guys, and so that's why you see them backfilling a lot of this.
yeah, and like the front end that they're doing right now, they're just wasting guys. Like it's like a point of pride for Wagner at this point that they're just and it's really just all Wagner in that area. It's not really Russian forces moving.
Yeah, around the Soledad and Bakhmut area, there's a lot of Wagner down there.
Yeah. And like I've just been looking at the numbers of how many of them are like dying every day and it's insane. The stuff that's going on there, it's like that it's the type of conflict where if you're in those trenches right now, it's like you don't come back home the same person no matter what.
Yeah, when I was in Ukraine, I was blessed to spend some time with an organization called Task Force 31, and I was able to train some of their guys. And I think they had a group of maybe 30 to 40 individuals that we were working with that week, and half of them had already come back from Bakhmut, and they were essentially the guys that had survived their initial rotation, and then the other half were guys that had just enlisted. And 3 weeks ago, these guys are carpenters, glass repairmen, shoe manufacturers, pretty standard individuals, and they had been given, I think, 3 to 4 weeks to prepare, and they were about to cycle back into Bakhmut. And it's hard to explain to someone that hasn't experienced war, um, like what Bakhmut is truly kind of like. Um, even most Westerners who have spent a couple of like let's just talk decades fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, none of us have the experience of what's going on these fronts
Yeah,
because
the cold factor is a completely different thing, and the
yes,
moisture.
it's a whole peer-to-peer operation. We come into a country and we decimate the air. We come in and we decimate the ground. Like we just completely wipe these things out. We then come in, we put heavy boots on ground and support each other. That's not really how the East is working. You've got attack helicopters, BMPs, BTRs, tanks of all types. Trench warfare where guys aren't really moving. It's just we haven't really experienced that or experienced heavy artillery bombardments against us.
Yeah,
So
the artillery going on both sides too. How like that's doesn't happen often in the world.
no, yeah, you're definitely very much seeing already shoot and then have to move because counter battery comes in, and it's that's not a normal thing for us either. We know our 155s are normally placed and pretty chill.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've heard that they've been going back and they're using like older artillery pieces because they have longer range as opposed to like their newer ones that can shoot more
Not so much
shells.
longer range. It's more like you're seeing guys cycle out like right, you've got the 155s and 105s, and like the really lightweight artillery became popular over there because they could fire a lot of rounds very quickly and then move that lightweight artillery piece very quickly. Where the 155 is a heavier piece, it does offer you GPS guided munitions, but there's a trade-off. And so guys over there are really kind of playing both hands of the deck. How heavy of fire can we shoot without getting counter batteried right away? And that's where like the weight distribution and being able to move quickly has become a big thing.
Well, if that's the case, would artillery not be becoming antiquated, just like tanks?
Artillery
Has
is the
has
main factor in Ukraine, I'd say.
I think
But that doesn't necessarily make it not antiquated. If that's the case and everyone's having struggles with artillery, would that not make it antiquated? Do something better.
I think what
They've
you're
got
going to see
missiles.
more of is the drones. You're seeing
Yeah.
like the heats that are coming in where your artilleries are firing, and there's plenty of this footage that's out there where artillery pieces are getting set up and they can just send a suicide kamikaze drone directly into you. And it's so tiny, all it has to do is send shrapnel into the barrels or whatnot, and it's going to damage the piece. If you spend time in the military, most military dudes know that you have an armory, and like that's where your weapons go and your nods go and all that other supplies. Now you're starting to see that there's an armory and there's a drone room, and those drone rooms are people that are just manufacturing and custom making different drones. And like I think it's FVP drones, the ones that you pilot with the goggles on, are becoming pretty popular over there.
They're sick. They're insane. Some of the footage from those are my favorite.
Yeah, I've done a couple coverages on those where you're seeing they're using different drone setups where they'll take an RPG, put it on the bottom, take the booster out, and then they'll just drive it directly into the side of an armor. Um, and it works. The other ones that I just posted a video of was they had a big 8 quad rotor drone, and they had taken, I think it was initially 3D printed pieces of circular, I guess, tubing, and they would take an 81 millimeter mortar and slide it into the bottom of the tubing, and it would lock and grab the tail end of the mortar, and then they would put 6 to 8 of these around the bottom of the drone. An 81 millimeter mortar heat, that'll blow up pretty much any armor that's on the field, and they just free drop it on top of you. So I think that type of technology is going to just continue to move forward, and it's something that we haven't caught on so much in the United States on our
Well,
forces.
I was going to say this is actually, if you actually look at the military doctrine that they've come out with, this is a direction that the military has been talking about wanting to go. At the same time, they're
Yeah.
also developing rifles that we may not need, that are a little too heavy, but they have, I think they call it like additive manufacturing, but they're planning on like they like are planning on like being able to 3D print entire bases at some point.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah,
think
it's a
That'd be
big
cool.
truck that actually 3D prints rooms and ceilings.
yeah. And so it reminds me, if you've played Death Stranding, that's what you basically do is print bridges to get around in the game. So
Mhm. Yeah, it's not going to slow down. You know, everyone that I've spoken to in some type of a capacity, whether it's frontline fighters, military, leadership, EOD, medical, they're all implementing drone technology in some way, shape, or form. Um, and so that's just going to continue to press forward, and I think it's going to continue to press forward very quickly. That advancement won't stop.
I mean, think about how quickly air power developed from World War One. That's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing literal dumb
The
bombs
the
dropped
the,
from
the
drones,
tank
just
and
like
the
World War One.
anti-tank gun too. Like,
Yeah,
Yeah, and what's scary is that you can't really do much about it. If there's no civilian drones in Ukraine. That was something I kind of asked a few people that were in military and law enforcement, and they are adamant no one's allowed to fly them. So if you see one pop up, you know that usually it's for some reason, unless you've got some type of pass somehow.
yeah.
It's usually either up there for reconnaissance or it's got something attached to the bottom of it. And speaking with a fair amount of guys, it's very scary because you can pop a DJI up for 8 to 15 minutes worth of flight time, and they're very small. They're very hard to shoot out of the air. If they're high enough, they're very hard to hear. All these things now have fair amount of them have thermal systems on them. They can GPS locate you right away. You don't know if it's a friendly or if it's not a friendly. Um, it's just so the fight kind of like stops for like a couple of minutes while these things start flying up and watching movements. And then once it comes back down, everything kind of like restarts again. So it's an interesting kind of like what you're saying, how the technology is starting to shape the battlefield again, much like it did, the machine gun in World War One or airplanes in World War One. I think this is something that we are going to see a big change in the way that guys fight.
and I mean, if you look at Iran, Mossad's favorite weapon to hit them with right now are just these quadcopters. And they hit them so hard that they caused an earthquake. Not the one that just happened in Turkey, but literally when they bombed Iran, an earthquake happened. It was a small earthquake was registered because Iran has all these tunnels, so they're able to like detonate a lot of shit in those tunnels, whatever they did.
Hmm. Yeah, it's you've got all kinds of different technology of the drone coming out, whether it's a loiter, something that's flying around and moving, whether it's quadcopters. I mean, it's not gonna it's not gonna slow down, and it's just gonna get scarier.
Yeah, and then we also have the factor of the Iranian drones too. And I'm not sure, but it seems like the just manufacturing these quadcopters are kind of more effective than these Iranian drones.
Well, you could say that, and I think that you have a big support chain that's coming behind Ukraine in that application. You could look at guys like Mark Hamill, for example. That guy was able to put in 500 plus drones on his own accord and is now a spokesperson for United 24. So if you have one guy that can do, who's obviously a celebrity, but he can do a fundraising and pull 500 drones, that's a big amount of technology that falls in from one avenue. And that's not even, talking about anything that's coming over support wise. That's just straight open source civilians. And you've got another guy, who is it that runs now Twitter? Elon. When you have a private sector that can
That's so funny. You forgot his name. He would die. He would die if he knew that.
yeah. That he's a private sector individual, but can come in and put Starlink into a country and immediately give forces the ability to communicate. That it's not even military. You're talking about the civilians that are coming in that can change the course of a warfare on their own accord. It's just not really something I've seen before.
I mean, it's the kind look at what GPS did for us.
Yeah, it was big. Blue
Yeah.
Force Tracker was a big thing for us.
Hmm. Looking at this new generation of warfare, it's like I don't think a lot of people like. It was so predictable that it was going to go towards drones, and the amount of investment that was put into like things that weren't drones is just kind of like I just kind of look at it and I'm like, come on, man! Like we saw, well, like when ISIS used these things, like they were just quadcopters, and like They immediately had to start taking out wherever ISIS was getting drones from and stop the supply of drones because they were so effective.
It's kind of hard to stop that now. I mean, you can buy drones off Alibaba,
Yeah,
DJI.
fortunately, ISIS came right before the time when you could get them so easily. I mean, just imagine if the insurgency in Iraq had them, and they had access to just because they were just eventually just taking RKGs and making landmines out of them to take out armor.
Yeah, I have never experienced that. That was very much after my time. The most that we've ever had was like a little recon drone that we could fly out back in the day. So to really see this and experience the change, it's very eye opening and like shocking to see it because it's more it's so autonomous and it's taking the almost the human element out of it because if you're a guy on the ground, you're still making the decisions of like pulling the trigger or yes, I am going to confirm to drop the bomb or yes, there is like bad dudes inside of this house. But the whole drone application now is just so disconnected. You know, I think we've all seen the amount of like drones flying over guys in foxholes and just dropping a grenade on them. There's not really a whole lot of chance where artillery can fall around you, and it's still a human, loading that round. Drones just to me are a little it's just weird. It's weird warfare. It's very impersonable, and I think it takes away what you're doing to another human with that operator on the other side.
You are 100% correct. This is a very dangerous thing. Is drone warfare is going to make it more like a video game. You remember
Just
those
about
videos?
to say, I was just about to say,
You remember those videos of the U.S. helicopters gunning down people in Afghanistan?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Afghanistan?
WikiLeaks.
Yeah,
That was the
yeah.
big WikiLeaks
I think that was the one that came from WikiLeaks. The one
yeah,
where they
that was
killed the
Chelsea. That was
journalist.
part of Chelsea Manning's leak.
Yes. Okay.
hmm
Now, now it actually looks like a video game. Like all the footage, all the drone footage, the thermal footage, it all looks like a video game, and that is the dangerous part because they're not going to start hiring soldiers now. They're going to start hiring tech bros.
Well, and remember, like the pilot and the gunner still have to be in the airplane to do that. They're while they are looking at a heads up display, they're physically there in danger, physically there confirming that the drone, you're just sitting back and, there is no confirmation really. You're not really doing anything besides going to your area of operation, making your cup of coffee and plugging into your drone for the day. Um, long range drones like that are a little bit different than what some of these guys on the ground are doing with short range operative drones. Um, but you're seeing that technology grow because it didn't used to be that guys just had drones in their backpacks and popped them up either. And that's where we've come now. Now you've got long range drones overwatching. You've got drones that have missiles on them. You've got guys that can take a little drone out of their backpack and throw a grenade on the bottom of it and send it into the window. It's just it's a whole different type of application. It's like welcome. What you're seeing is modern warfare. It's just a weird It's a weird time of war. Because you have a very old Slavic mind of just artillery bombarding the shit out of each other, but then you also have this high technology range that's flying in. I don't know if you saw the sea drones that were made, where guys were
Oh,
taking
those are sick, dude.
kayaks.
The ones that they're crashing
speeders.
into the boat, they're crashing into warships out there.
Yeah, they're taking speeders,
Torpedoes. They're basically
fiberglassing them together,
torpedoes.
putting pressure plates on them, using Starlink so that they can actually control it and see where it goes, and they just drive them out into the Black Sea and impact it into things. This is the route that we're at now.
Well, it is very, very funny that it does reflect these video games. Just to go back to it for a second, it's funny that it really, really does reflect these video games that they called modern warfare. It's very funny how fiction leads fact.
Yeah, I think look, people still get off on war, right? That's like, why do you think there's tens of thousands of people that follow Project Leaflet? Because they want to be as upfront and personal as they can be to war without having to step foot and experience it. And Call of Duties and all that obviously feed it. That's one of the reasons why I enlisted was motivational videos from the army. I think that's just part of the game, and now it's just advanced to where the military is actually meeting with the graphics of video games. You know, it's always kind of been the video games or movies emulate what we do in the military, right? Now technology is just good enough that they're both mirroring each other. Soon enough you'll be able to put VR on and plug directly into a shooter and experience everything. They made a movie about that called Gamer.
Okay, so you've seen combat, you've been on the other side, you've been a journalist in combat, you've been the one in combat. Has your opinion of the military changed? Are you less enthusiastic? Going back now, would you join knowing, what you know now, would you join the military again? And sort of expand on your current opinions of the military. Sorry
Yeah,
for the long-winded question.
No, it's a good question. No, I'm very pro military. I was not a good kid. Like, to be straight out and clear, I was arrested twice in the same week, like kicked out of multiple schools. I was not a good kid. Um, and I was one of the guys, back in the day that turned on the TV and watched the second plane impact a tower. And that was something that was like kind of an eye-opening experience for me. And I didn't really have another path. And so military gave me something that I could kind of like, hey, this is a career. Like, hey, this is what leadership looks like. And hey, this is why you get up and you make your bed. Or hey, this is why you can trust people to your right and the left. So for me, the military was something that I think I needed at that time in my life. Where I look at it now is I'm older. I'm 37. I'm the baby of my platoon. I was the youngest guy that deployed with the rest of my dudes. And now I try and advise a lot of guys. I don't necessarily like the direction that the militaries have taken in like the softening of the branches. I think that they need to be more
You talking
below.
about woke nonsense?
Yeah. Yes, but going back to it, I would definitely say I'm pro military. I think it's good for people, especially those don't have another path. I mean, like, dude, I got $80,000 for college. It set me up for getting when I got out. Um, so I wouldn't down talk it. There's definitely a reason that it exists. Um, and if you're fine with understanding that you're the Republic, then hey, man, that's more power to you. There's definitely a lot of down talking of it, right? Especially like in today's age, like look at law enforcement, everyone ACAB, right? Every cop's a bastard. Um, people get lumped into things very easily, even though there's a lot of people that do very good in those professions. And the military kind of gets lumped in that sometimes as
I
well.
think I think with cops there's a different power dynamic going on.
Yeah, look, military's not cops because that culture kind of a type of like, trickles over a little bit. But I think people misunderstand that the military is, it's huge. Like the army is huge. It's got 300 plus jobs, but there is a small percentage of those guys that their whole entire role is just to break shit. And when we go into countries, that's what we do. When we stay in there for longevity of time, like Iraq or Afghanistan, it weighs on the military as well because the public doesn't like to see that type of I guess aggression that you could say, like
Yeah, it was
war.
interesting because in the invasion of Iraq, it was all televised, and then like after that, like because like if you remember, there was footage that they aired. I think it was even like CNN, where it was somebody who was injured in an operation the day before. A journalist filmed the guy executing the guy who was already like injured on the floor, and like that was a big deal at the time. And they just like were like, no more journalists, get out.
You know, look, there's war exists and bad shit happens in war, right? Unfortunately, the more that it becomes televised and seen, I think the forces have their hands handcuffed a bit more because the public doesn't like to see how war is conducted sometimes. That's why you saw like year 2004, 5, and not 6 so much, but there were a lot of hunter killer teams that were in Iraq, and those guys were we were hunting a lot. And that became a pretty big no-no once the public started hearing about it and just taking their own opinions on why we were doing that type of mission set. And so, unfortunately, that also hampers like the ability to track down guys. Like why did all of a sudden we were so close to catching Al Zarqawi back in the day, and then it took another 2 years? The way that you hunt is not always nice and peaceful. Violence does solve problems.
So when you were in Iraq, in my opinion, arguably in one of the most important places at the most important time in the entire campaign. It was a pretty big deal where you are. You're one of the few people that were actually actively fighting Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, Mosul was an interesting place. 2004 was an interesting year for Iraq. We had come in, and initially it was pretty quiet. But then once the Marines had retaken Fallujah, a lot of that heat kind of trickled up into Mosul. And then ourselves, 321 and Deuce 4, which was across the river, we really kind of got hit hard for the rest of our time frame in Iraq. It was a pretty interesting year.
And you see any chemical weapons from Al-Qaeda at that point? I think that it might have been too early. That might have been 2005.
No, there was right, like there was definitely chemical agents that we had found. There was a few
chlorine, stuff like that.
Chlorine. There were some blood agent compounds where there was
interesting
facilities. We had walked into a few things where our command had found stuff that wasn't mixed yet, and they were kind of separated off into barrels. Everyone likes to say that, hey, there was no, I guess, WMDs, and that's the other.
Zarqawi was a chemical weapons expert, so even if there wasn't, immediately there was once Al-Qaeda came in.
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of the public, when they hear that word WMD, the first thing that rings in people's minds is nukes, and that's a very small part of that circle that is munitions that fall into WMDs. Chemical, like blood agents, all these type of things that really mess you up outside of nuclear capability, those all fall under that as well. And they're easily transported and launched inside of artillery rounds, Scuds.
Just look at Syria and the chemical bombs that have been used there. Just pressurized chlorine tanks with a modified valve, some fins welded on it. Boom.
It's not hard. I mean, these guys are smart dudes. They're very ingenious in the munitions that they make. And look, there's a lot of sand out there. It's easy to bury stuff. And, like you just brought up, Syria is not too far from Iraq. It's easy to move munitions around as well in the Middle East.
In 2004, you also had the second Battle of Fallujah. That's when you're saying is when shit really hit the fan.
Yeah, we had gone into Mosul, I believe it was October of 2004, rotating through to 2005, and it was fairly quiet. There was still fighting that was happening in Mosul, but most of the attention was down in the Fallujah area because the Marines had wanted to retake it. I think there was a unit from the strikers that offered to go down that way to support them, and then we had stayed up top with Mosul with Deuce 4 as well. And then once the retaking happened, a lot of the insurgency rotated up into Mosul, and the dynamic of the city really changed pretty drastically, very quickly.
The unfortunate thing about Fallujah is that it forced the Iraqi insurgency to start siding with Al-Qaeda, and they hadn't been working together up until that point. One insurgency was one branch that's up there, that was up where you were. They were totally involved with Al-Qaeda, but the main one in Fallujah, they didn't really like Al-Qaeda because they weren't fighting for the interest of Iraq, and these people were fighting for their interest in Iraq.
Sure, so. Right. Yeah, and it's for us, it's a very small scope compared to like what command's looking at the large scale. For me, it's just a dude with a machine gun and here to support my guys.
Al-Qaeda are criminals. They said they were here to fight the occupation. It's all lies. They are only killing Muslims.
Sunni armed groups are a complicated web of alliances among Iraqi nationalists, Islamists, former Iraqi army officers, and a few Baathists. The turning point was this demonstration in Fallujah in May 2003. The Americans had based themselves in a school. The people of Fallujah protested, U.S. soldiers fired and killed 17 demonstrators. The tactics were clear: attack American soldiers and kidnap foreigners and any Iraqi cooperating with the coalition forces. Fallujah became the stronghold. However, the U.S., backed by Iraqi forces, waged 2 full-scale assaults on the city to destroy this safe haven. It resulted in the fighters spreading to the rest of El-Anbar province, Mosul in the north, the Diyala province, Baghdad, and the so-called Triangle of Death, south of the capital.
Do you think the U.S. Army made an effect, a positive effect? Do you think that their presence in the country was necessary or needed, or do you think that it became unnecessary? Do you think it was necessary in the
I just
start?
wanted to say that killing Saddam was a good thing.
That's a pretty loaded question, right? I think Saddam and his sons were pretty bad dudes. They kept the country in control, but they did it through a pretty piss poor means. Did I see a lot of good in my time in Iraq? Like, yeah, there's definitely moments that I feel very proud about. One of them was we were there for the very first voting that had ever happened for the people. I remember watching an entire line of people with their thumbs inked because they were willing to stand in the middle of a firefight because the guys wanted to shoot them, not to vote. But for them to have the option to even say like, yay, this person or nay, this person, that's something that I hold dear. I think that's you start to see like, oh, there's options. Seeing women start to drive is something where you're like, oh shit, like we're making a change. Like that's not normally something. I think that question's hard for people that are directly on the ground, right? Because you're seeing those changes in such a different application than maybe high command is, where they're seeing entire changes over the entire country. We're seeing it from a very small scope in a very small sector of a very large country. But I think when you see those little small changes, or we ran a checkpoint called TCP-28, and it was to make sure that every vehicle came in and out of Mosul was checked, and they had all these TCPs around the entire city. Every car came in, every car came out, was checked. And high risk, but I think it was high reward. And we would always see this school bus that came in the northern part of it, and there was kids that were up there, and they would always put different drawings up on the windows, and it was drawings of like us and saying thank you and like that stuff that I remember, right? So when I see and think about that, I think those are the moments that I kind of hold on to, and I'm like, yeah, man, like I made a difference out there, and hopefully with enough of the kids that they'll remember it growing up. That's a big thing.
I would say that definitely, like, it's a really different generation coming to age right now, and those were probably the kids that were there when you were there.
Yeah, like we handed out a lot of Beanie Babies. That was a big thing back then. Taking off our helmets and armor and stopping in the middle of Iraq and playing a game of soccer.
Yeah, as bad of a movie it is, that's one of my favorite parts of Hurt Locker is like him like interacting with the kid in the movie.
Yeah, and that's we do that for multiple reasons. It's the same reason why if there's a tribal council of like people inside of a town and they all meet, right, and they discuss what they need to work on and what they need to build. You go and you sit there and you take your helmet off and you sit with them. And it's like a show of respect. And if you can get involved and play with kids and like show that I'm not worried about like getting shot here, like that type of mindset and the way that you present yourself can really make a change on I think a kid's impact of you, and that's something that you have to remember. Yes, especially as infantry, you're there to break stuff, but you also have to, it's a very hard job because you have to control both emotion ranges of one moment you may be blowing up doors and shooting people, and the next block down you may be handing out Beanie Babies and hugs and playing with kids with pencils and things like that. And that's something that it became very hard to kind of like understand how to control for a while, but I think is one of the more important and impactful things that you hope that comes out of this war.
And I think there's a lot of people can make the argument that Daesh wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the U.S. military presence in Iraq. But the thing is that what's really important about them, kind of a silver lining to their existence, is that the first guys that came up and were working with the US, a lot of them were selling out for paychecks and things like that. But once ISIS came, they displaced these people from their homes, especially in Mosul, um, and those people started fighting back. They were able to liberate themselves, and it put them in a much better position in that aspect, where they now have a way more coordinated military program. They're
Mhm.
not as disorganized. So in a way, it actually did help the country in a very weird, offhanded way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you're even seeing like the ISAF who's still holding on. You know, they
Yeah, we were going to talk about them, so
you know
forgot
they
about that.
they really are a huge implementation force that came from our involvement over there, and the way that they operate, the way they communicate and talk to each other. They've been fairly good in what they do, and they were a huge reason why Mosul was taken again and why ISIS was kicked out. It's essentially their special operation unit, which is really the only guys kind of hanging on in there right now, considering that there's not really a structured government in Iraq currently.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but are you aware that in 2002, Al Qaeda was talking about getting the US to invade Iraq?
No, I'm not too like I would say spun up as much as you guys are in
But
regards to like the
this
small
is just
details.
something that's always fascinated me because I've looked into it. The guy who's more than likely going to be the emir. I don't know what's going on and why they haven't voted for a new one. I don't know. They're not really the Al Qaeda they used to be, I guess. But this guy actually wrote a document because he was their chief, like military trainer. Like he was a colonel in the Egyptian military under Sadat. So like this dude is a serious fighter, and he was one of the only person who disagreed with doing 9/11. He didn't think it was the right call, and he was right because the thing is we came in and we destroyed his entire, like, he spent so many years shaping this elite task force, and we just came in and destroyed them. And so they were on their last legs in 2002, and he wrote what would become the Management of Savagery, which is the principal document that influences Al Qaeda and Daesh today. But they had it down to the years, where it's like, this year we'll do this, yes, this year we'll do that. And they said right there that the principal strategy should get them to invade a country like Iraq, Jordan, or Syria. And so one of the reasons why we invaded Iraq, one of the small reasons, there was many of the things that they tried to play up to get in there, was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. He was shipped to Egypt and he was tortured in Egypt. And under torture, he said that Saddam Hussein is working with Al Qaeda to get weapons of mass destruction. And we know that he made this up at the time, but we don't know if he was told by Al Qaeda to say this. And that was the
Interesting.
plan from the start. So I think there's a lot of things that could establish a motivation where the US was manipulated to going in there. And a lot of times while they were still in there, Al Qaeda was manipulating things. And I think it took a while for the US to figure out how to actually combat Al Qaeda. And they were just killing us with information. They could just outthink us in so many ways.
I would agree with that. Remember all those guys have is time, right? Where our president and all them tend to rotate every 4 to 8 years, and then they tend to change their cabinet, their leadership, their understanding of information. Where some of these other organizations, like what you're speaking of, they don't necessarily need to do that. And if you have to wait 20 years or 30 years,
I'm very curious. Like, being in a wartime scenario, being on the ground, was there a feeling of imminent death? Like, was that a feeling that was going around, or is it
in
less so?
Iraq or Ukraine,
Both.
um, I wouldn't say imminent death. Like, that's not really, I guess, like in your mind, right? Um, Iraq was very, you're very structured almost for us. Like, it's like, hey, you're doing a 4 hour mission. If that may run longer if it goes bad, when you come back, you've got 4 hours. Go work out, go eat, go do whatever you need. Maybe you'll do 4 hours of guard shift. Hey, then you got 4 hour mission. And so you're on this kind of rotation with all your buds, and you trust those guys, right? So I don't know if there wasn't a position where I was like, oh shit, this is like bad, like this is real bad, because we do a lot of support by fire and we bring a lot of hate. I think there was moments when a lot more shock when we lost someone, or if uh, you know, I lost my lieutenant over there, and he was very close to a lot of us, and I still remember like the play by play of like everything that happened, what the platoon did, and sometimes you just can't stop things. I remember the first time I stepped out of a truck in Iraq, and we were in the middle of a circle, and I think that was like, oh shit, this is real. Like I pointed a gun at someone that was walking towards me, and all he did was kind of take a left, walk 10 paces, take a right, and just keep on walking by me. And it was like, okay, these guys really don't care. I'm feeling pretty insecure here. And I think that was more of like an eye-opening experience of like, okay, like you kind of need to change your parameter of the way that you're thinking, more than, oh shit, like we're gonna die. Ukraine
Was that? Sorry, just before you get onto
No, go
Ukraine, was
ahead.
that almost was it almost a realization of the lack of authority that you had? Is that more what it was?
Yeah, I think there was a like, remember these people have been in a war zone for their whole entire lives and been uh, commanded by an iron fist, right? So sometimes coming off as like a nice guy doesn't really kind of get you anywhere.
Saddam also tortured his own soldiers for morale boosts. That's
Right.
the
Yeah.
type of military we're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. Like, let's go back to like when they had an Olympic team and when they lost and they tortured all the Olympians that were in Iraq. It's the way that country was managed was not
There's a
great.
story about a officer that would have to bring his own lash with him everywhere he went because he screwed up so much and would be whipped so many times on,
Yeah.
on the feet.
And look, we obviously do corrective punishment and stuff like that, but ours is in the form of like push-ups and like you're doing a run and go find me a pretty rock, and we're not beating you to death. And so I think there's a huge change there, right? Um, but yeah, to your point, I think there was a realization of like, hey, there's the authority and the way that you have to interact, I guess, is a little bit different than what I expected. And I still remember, how real things are over there when we rolled up on a one of our first missions in Iraq. We had supported an MP, a military police unit, that had gotten hit by an IED or a suicide bomber, I think it was, and he blew himself up. None of the troops got hurt, and we rolled up as like QRF, a quick response force, to support them. And I vividly remember talking to the guys, and I'm like, "Hey, what do you want us to do with the body and the brains of this guy?" And his response was, he looked right at me and he said, "Fuck them. The dogs will eat it all. Leave it." And I was like, "Okay, we're in a different type of world." And that was just a unit, that had been there for like 10 months or whatever in rotation. So like their mindset and level of coldness was different than like our rotation rolling in. And so you start to understand the parameters of like how the game's played and the way that you have to be kind of like in a mindset.
So on this depressing topic of death, I was going to say, so obviously a lot more people die in Ukraine. Do you
Yes.
think that it's easier to deal with if there's a lot of people dying around you than if there's just like the rare occasional dude that you're really close with?
I think the harder thing about it is that, you know, you can't really compare it from like, let's say, World War One or two, where there were so many of these guys that were dying. Now in Ukraine, a perfect example is our medic that was with us and our translator, Alex, great kid. Kid's 22 years old, Olympic snowboarder, gave it all up so that he can help his country. And we were having a conversation one time about um, his friends that he knew and how they had all graduated, and he had 44 of them. And he was like, 8 months has gone by and I have two of them alive. And I don't know if it's necessarily an easier topic to say, hey, 30 of my friends are dead, and how do I cope with that? Compared to whether I have one friend that was very close to me and we lost him because sniper fire or something. It's situational, but death is death. And it's very hard to cope with it and understand it, I think, until you've been around it. And I think it's harder on the mind, in my personal, I guess, opinion, when you're seeing such a large amount of your friends go away. I couldn't imagine losing all 50 of my platoon dudes in one mission. I don't know if you ever get used to losing people. I think you prepare as much as you can and you support each other as much as you can to minimize the amount of possibilities of it. But if it's your time, it's kind of your time, and it can happen by numerous amounts of reasons, right? Whether it's a guy sniping you from a mile away or a couple hundred yards away, or hey, an artillery round comes in and knocks out 4 of you because of shrapnel. It's you just kind of become, I think, numb to the aspect of that is part of the game, and that can happen at any point in time, but you try and minimize those risks as much as you can.
Okay, now let's transition to something nice. to put
Well,
at the end here, just not something so grim.
I did have a question though. Could you are we finishing up? What are we doing?
I mean, it's been pretty solid. I think we can wrap up pretty, like 15 minutes for padding.
Yeah, I'm here for you guys.
Well, I was going to ask you, just to close, to recite us a story from either Ukraine or Iraq. Dealer's choice, I guess.
Yeah,
just sort of a wartime story, or a story on the job, or whatever you want.
I got a good story for you that was, and I videotaped it, luckily, while I was in the car in Ukraine. We were heading east, and we actually connected with a security team that some of our friends gave us, and they were there predominantly because as we were heading heavily east, it gets pretty. You just need to know what you're doing. It's just a different dynamic than on the west side. And when we were entering into kind of like the border area that separates, it's like, hey, like this is your kind of you're in a danger zone now. I was recording, and our security lead came over the top of our radio that we had, and he was driving in front of us, and he gave us just a nice warning saying, welcome to Ukrainian tour. Your chances of dying today are 60%, but luckily the weather outside is quite nice. Welcome and have a good day. And it was just kind of like, okay, like we're no longer in Kyiv or Lviv where things are quite normal. Like, you are now entering into the danger zone. Like take this serious. And that was kind of an interesting dynamic of, the dark humor that still is around all this type of military lifestyle and how you cope with it all, right?
Yeah, that's a really big thing, is people not understanding military humor.
There's a lot of it, man. I have a bunch of photos where, the age generation is so different now from when I was in Iraq. GoPros didn't exist yet. Having a Game Boy Color or something, or the old PS when it had the mini discs, was like technology was just moving forward. Now these guys have TikToks, and putting music overlay on every video is very much what this generation does. And I think writing on your kit is a way to also get that comedy across, and in a way to get that expression out. And so we saw a lot of guys in Ukraine that they had written, like, on their medical pouches, last chance, like, hope this works, just like. And it was on like a lot of different things that you would see where the comedy was just kind of placed around in little places. And if you paid attention enough, you could pick up and be almost put into that type of lifestyle a little bit more.
That's exactly what I would do in that situation.
Yeah.
I have a tendency that if I get something, I can't leave it untouched. It needs to have something on it.
Yeah, like stickers on guns and carvings and things like that.
So we've seen this guy lately who's got the cat ears.
Yeah, I've seen him. Yep. It's very normal over there. Where we see it, it's like weird, but we'll wear unit patches, but to them they'll have like 10 patches on, and it's just all kinds of different symbolic or anime or funny death cards, or to them it's an expression, where to us we see it as like unit patches and very specific reasons why we have it on there. Them, they're expressing themselves in such a different way than what we did in war.
I think it's because they're civilians. It's not
It could
necessarily
be.
that they're military; they're conscripts.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. There's a lot of people that have joined, and a lot of people that were pulled in. And so you're seeing a very large spread of individuals come into these ranks, and it's a lot of younger generation.
I was about to say, this is some Gen Z TikTok bullshit. That's what's going on here.
Yeah, but again, to them, like it helps get out that emotional range, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and
music.
Bellingcat said that I think 70% of their war crime evidence has come from TikTok.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, like on both sides, think about it. These people are just learning about what geolocation is. We saw that early in the war where Russians were filming themselves with like 203 grenade systems launching mortars, and they're literally filming themselves in the same exact moment, the same exact area where the thing's getting detonated at, and it gets destroyed within an hour because you could geolocate it, find it on a map, and detonate it. And that's, I think, part of the US is very blessed, right? Like we have understanding and access to so much technology that if you look at Russia, for example, Russia's a very big country, but the population's not generally very large. And some of the people that live in some of the other harsher areas, don't have access to a lot of global access that we may have. They're very cut off from the rest of the world, even more so now where, Facebook, Instagram, and all these access are pulled from those countries. And so the intelligence of individuals just may not be nearly what we're used to sometimes. And it starts to show.
Because, like, um, and when they first invaded, they were on CCTV the entire time. And like it took them so long to realize that they had to move the cameras. So like every like where everyone was counted and logged, and it was like and everyone was watching it live and just like counting them up through as they went down the road.
Yeah. Well, when I was in Kyiv, you saw a lot of bus stations that were also had spray painting on all their maps, because it was known that Russia was using older maps and didn't have up to date
That's awesome.
systems. And so to them, they started really breaking down and spray painting a lot of these maps so that they couldn't figure out what the updated routes were. And everything over there is open encrypted communication. It's very rare to see anything encrypted. So there's people that are on Reddit that were old dads with like
Yeah,
AC
Reddit caused a
radios.
few people to die.
Yeah, well, it's Reddit. But what they were doing was they were going into these Russians communications, bouncing their signals off, and being able to open talk inside of communication with the Russians. And so when a fight was going off, they would just hold their keys and block all the communication because nothing's encrypted. So it's, you can hear both sides talk. You can tap into radio comms on both sides. So it's very different than the way that we operate.
All right, we want to close with anything, Jack?
No, I'm pretty happy.
Okay, so let's just kind of say, let's do a nice little wrap up with 6-month outreach with Ukraine and what you think is going to be happening there.
6-month outreach. Hopefully I'll be able to find myself back in country. And I think you're going to continue to see a hard push through the east from Russia. They're trying for Bakhmut, and they're really pumping up a lot of guys. I think the winter will slow things down some, but it's not going to be an easy fight for either side.
All right, that's pretty good right there.